Of her own grandfather, she had 4 children. This is the dark and disturbing history of the Caldwell family, inhabitants of the depths of the Missouri mountains, where for generations, geographical and social isolation has paved the way for practices that defy not only the laws of society but also those of human nature itself. In the early 1950s, while the rest of America thrived in the post-war period, there were communities that remained practically untouched by progress among the dense forests and hidden valleys of the Missouri mountains. On a 40-acre property away from the main and virtually invisible roads lived the Caldwell family, isolated from the outside world. The first news about the Caldwells arrived at the authorities in 1957 when a lost hunter happened to chance upon the property and witnessed something that deeply disturbed him. He saw children with visible physical characteristics of genetic degeneration, working alongside adults with countenances that suggested far too close a kinship. The family patriarch, Harold Caldwell, born in 1897, ruled the small clan with an iron hand. A widower since 1943 when his wife Mabel passed away during the delivery of his 3rd daughter, Harold had moved further from civilization, creating his own rules and establishing a kind of isolated microculture where his word was absolute law. What happens in the mountains stays in the mountains. This was the unofficial motto of the isolated families of this region, and for the Caldwells, it became the justification for behaviors that would be considered unthinkable anywhere else. Martha Caldwell, born in 1938, was Harold's granddaughter. Her mother, Eliza, had died when Martha was only 8 years old, leaving her in her grandfather's care. What the authorities would discover years later would surpass the limits of human understanding. From the age of 13, a forbidden relationship was established between Martha and her own grandfather, resulting in the birth of 4 children between 1952 and 1957. Preliminary investigations revealed a pattern of consanguineous unions dating back to previous generations in the Caldwell family. The isolation was not only geographical but ideological. Harold, whose parents themselves were first-degree cousins, had grown up with the distorted notion that maintaining pure blood was a tradition to be preserved. Dr. William Reynolds, a rural doctor who first documented the case to the authorities in 1958, described the situation as the most extreme example of human degradation by prolonged consanguinity that I have witnessed in my 30 years of medical practice. In his confidential report to the Missouri Department of Social Services, he wrote, "The children showed clear signs of genetic problems, reduced stature, atypical facial characteristics, obvious cognitive difficulties, and in 2 cases, congenital heart malformations." The most disturbing was the normalization of this reality within that microcosm. When the authorities intervened, Martha, then 20, showed clear signs of psychological conditioning and did not fully understand that her situation was not normal. For her, that was the only reality she had ever known. The Caldwell property, with its main wooden dwelling and small attached buildings, formed a family complex where approximately 17 people lived, all related through close blood ties. The isolation was so deep that some of the youngest children could barely articulate words, having developed their own form of communication almost incomprehensible to strangers. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. The stories we reveal are fundamental historical documents that remain deliberately hidden from official books. Only our subscribers have access to these forbidden truths that shape our society to this day. The history of consanguinity in the Caldwell family did not start with Harold and his granddaughter Martha. Historical documents recovered by social researchers revealed a pattern that dated to the late 19th century when the first Caldwells settled in the Ozark Mountains. Josiah Caldwell, Harold's grandfather, had arrived in the region in 1878, fleeing accusations in North Carolina. The records indicated that Josiah had already been investigated for inadequate family practices in his homeland, although the euphemistic language of the time made it difficult to determine the exact nature of the accusations. In the mountains of Missouri, Josiah found the perfect isolation to establish his own kingdom. He married his second-degree cousin Abigail, and together they had 8 children, 3 of whom did not survive beyond their first years of life due to undiagnosed congenital complications. This first generation of Caldwells in Missouri established a pattern of deep distrust of the outside world. They educated their children without contact with formal schools, developed their own folk medicine system, and rejected any external interference, even when offered as aid. These isolated families develop a kind of ideological protective shield, explained Dr. Elena Simmons, an anthropologist who studied isolated communities in the Appalachians and Ozarks during the 1960s. For them, the outside world represents a threat to their existence, and any external practice is seen as corrupt or dangerous. The next generation of Caldwells deepened this isolation. Ernest Caldwell, son of Josiah and Harold's father, married his own first cousin, Susan. This union, held without any official record in 1895, produced 5 children, including Harold. Fragmentary medical records recovered from a traveling doctor who visited the region in 1910 indicated that all the sons of Ernest and Susan had distinctive characteristics of consanguinity, including short stature, severe dental problems, and a tendency to chronic respiratory diseases. Harold, born in 1897, grew up in this environment where endogamy was normalized and even encouraged. In 1920, he married Mabel Jenkins, a young woman from an equally isolated neighboring family. What was not documented at the time but was discovered during the 1958 investigations was that Mabel was actually his second-degree cousin on the maternal side. The union of Harold and Mabel produced 3 children: Daniel, 1923, Eliza, 1927, and Ruth, 1943. Mabel passed away during Ruth's delivery, leaving Harold to raise his 3 children alone, which further intensified his isolation and distrust of the outside world. Eliza, Martha's mother, was briefly married to James Turner, an outsider who worked on road construction in the region. This was one of the few moments when new blood entered the Caldwell lineage. However, James abandoned Eliza when he discovered her pregnancy, and she returned to the family property with her newborn daughter, Martha. When Eliza died in 1946, a victim of untreated pneumonia, Martha was placed entirely under the care of her grandfather, Harold. The testimonials collected in 1958 suggest that it was during this time that Harold began to psychologically prepare his granddaughter for the role he intended her to assume. It's a classic case of conditioning and isolation, explained Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, a forensic psychiatrist consulted during the investigations. With no external references of normality, the child gradually accepts the distorted reality presented to her as unique and natural. Martha, growing up without contact with other children outside the family circle, without formal education, and without exposure to conventional social values, became the perfect victim for Harold's psychological control. At age 13 in 1951, the forbidden relationship was established, resulting in the birth of her first child, Adam, the following year. Between 1952 and 1957, Martha gave birth to 4 children: Adam, Sarah, Joseph, and Rebecca. All had clear signs of genetic problems resulting from extreme consanguinity. Adam was born with a cardiac malformation that required medical care, but Harold refused to seek help, resulting in the boy's death at the age of 3. The records indicate that the official cause of death was recorded as a fever, but later investigations suggested it was due to untreated complications of his congenital heart condition. The fate of the Caldwell family moved irrevocably in November 1957 when Hunter Frank Weber got lost during a storm in the Ozark Mountains. Seeking shelter, he accidentally found the Caldwell property and witnessed scenes that deeply disturbed him. "I saw children who didn't seem normal," Weber told authorities in Jefferson City. "There was something wrong with their faces, the way they moved, and the way that old man looked at the young girl. It wasn't a grandfather's gaze toward a granddaughter." Disturbed by what he saw, Weber was not well received by the family. Harold Caldwell expelled him from the property under the sight of a shotgun. Upon returning to civilization, Weber reported his observations to local sheriff John Pritchard, who initially proved skeptical. "We have many isolated families in these mountains, Frank," said the sheriff. "They are different, yes, but we cannot interfere just because they live in their own way." However, when Weber mentioned the apparent conditions of the children and the young age of their mother, the sheriff was obliged to investigate. In January 1958, accompanied by Dr. William Reynolds and 2 deputies, Pritchard visited the Caldwell property. What they found confirmed and surpassed the initial suspicions. Martha, then 20, had 3 living children, Sarah, Joseph, and Rebecca, and was pregnant again. All 3 presented signs of evident genetic problems. Sarah, then 4, could barely speak. Joseph, at 3, had a visibly small head, and Rebecca, at only 1 year, had distorted facial characteristics. I was disgusted by what I saw, but even more so by Harold's attitude, Sheriff Pritchard later reported. He showed no sign of shame or remorse. On the contrary, he seemed to consider it his natural right. The initial intervention was complicated by geographical isolation and Harold's violent resistance. When the authorities tried to remove Martha and the children, he reacted with a shotgun, resulting in a tense impasse that lasted several hours. It was Martha who surprisingly ended up disarming the situation. In a moment of clarity, possibly motivated by worry for her children, she agreed to accompany the authorities so that Rebecca, who had a high fever, could receive medical care. This momentary decision opened a window to the outside world that would never close again for the Caldwells. Martha and her children were taken to Jefferson City, where they received medical attention and underwent psychological and social assessments. If you are watching this story, leave in the comments "Blood Speaks" so that I know you are following these historical revelations that have been deliberately hidden from official history. The initial medical examination confirmed the worst suspicions. Dr. Reynolds documented that the children had multiple signs of prolonged consanguinity, congenital heart problems, severely compromised cognitive development, facial and cranial malformations, short stature for age, and a weakened immune system. Martha herself, the product of previous generations of consanguinity, had similar signs, although less pronounced. The most shocking discovery, through blood tests available at the time, was that the children had extremely high homozygosity, a technical term indicating a severe lack of genetic diversity. Though advanced genetic tests were not available in 1958, the methods of the time were enough to confirm that Harold was both the grandfather and the father of the children. While Martha and her children remained under care in Jefferson City, authorities returned to the Caldwell property for further investigation. What they found revealed the true extent of the situation: Harold's personal diaries, which coldly documented his intentions to purify the Caldwell lineage, birth and death records that had never been officially declared, and evidence that other consanguineous relationships had occurred within the extended family. Daniel, Harold's eldest son, had a similar relationship with his own daughter, Mary, resulting in 2 children with severe developmental problems. Ruth, Harold's youngest daughter, had a son whose father was unclear but was suspected to be her own brother, Daniel. The magnitude of the case attracted the attention of experts in genetics, psychology, and social work from across the state of Missouri. Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, a forensic psychiatrist at the University of Missouri, was called to evaluate Martha psychologically. Martha Caldwell's case represents one of the most extreme examples of psychological manipulation and social isolation I have ever documented, Dr. Hoffman wrote in his confidential report. She was created in an environment where the normal limits of family relationships were completely distorted, where she had no access to any external reference of normality. The initial interviews with Martha revealed the depth of the psychological conditioning to which she had been subjected. She showed little understanding that her relationship with her grandfather was abnormal or prohibited. For her, that was simply the life she knew, the reality that had been presented to her as natural. "Grandpa always said our blood was special," Martha reported during one evaluation session. "He said outsiders wanted to dilute it, weaken it. It was our responsibility to keep it pure." As the Caldwell case progressed through the Missouri judicial system in 1958, the doctors and geneticists involved meticulously documented the physical and cognitive effects of extreme consanguinity presented by Martha's children. Dr. James Harrison, a geneticist at Washington University in St. Louis, was invited to examine the children and produce a comprehensive report on their condition. His work, later published in medical magazines with names altered to protect identities, became a fundamental case study on the effects of prolonged consanguinity. "What we observed in the Caldwell family is the accumulated result of multiple generations of consanguineous unions," wrote Dr. Harrison. "Martha's children are not only the product of the union between grandfather and granddaughter, but they carry in their genetic code the impact of at least 4 previous generations of marriages between close relatives." Sarah, Martha's 4-year-old eldest daughter, presented what doctors of the time called accumulated recessive features. Her cognitive capacity was severely compromised, her physical growth was delayed, and she suffered from frequent seizures. At 4, her vocabulary was limited to less than 10 understandable words. Joseph, the 3-year-old son, had microcephaly, a condition where the head and brain are significantly smaller than normal. This resulted in severe developmental delays and neurological problems that doctors anticipated would prevent him from developing basic self-care skills. Rebecca, the youngest at just 1 year, suffered from a congenital heart malformation similar to the one that had brought her older brother Adam to death. Immediate medical intervention was necessary to save her life, something that would have been impossible if she had remained isolated in the mountains. Martha's 4th child, still in pregnancy when she was removed from the Caldwells, was born in April 1958 at Jefferson City State Hospital. The boy, temporarily designated as Baby Caldwell in medical records, had multiple complications, including a cleft palate, fused fingers, syndactyly, and a complex heart malformation. Despite the efforts of the medical team, the baby died 3 days after birth. An autopsy revealed multiple internal defects that would have been incompatible with long-term life, even with medical intervention. Dr. Harrison carefully documented the observable genetic patterns in the children. What we are witnessing is the devastating expression of deleterious recessive genes that, in populations with normal genetic diversity, would remain dormant. The extreme homozygosity in the Caldwell children means that they inherited identical copies of harmful mutations from both mother and father-grandfather, eliminating the protective effect that genetic diversity usually provides. In simpler terms, each person carries potentially harmful mutations in their genetic code. Normally, these mutations remain harmless because we receive a healthy second copy of the gene from the other parent. However, when parents are close relatives, the probability of both carrying the same mutation increases dramatically, resulting in children who receive 2 copies of the harmful gene. Martha herself, the product of earlier, though less extreme, generations of consanguinity, also had physical signs of the practice, short stature, severe dental problems, and slight cognitive difficulties. However, the effects on her children were exponentially more severe due to the direct relationship with her grandfather. The medical team also documented that the Caldwell children had a significantly compromised immune system. Common childhood infections, such as colds and otitis, quickly became dangerous to them, demanding frequent medical intervention. It's as if their bodies are fighting a constant battle against their own compromised genetic code, said Dr. Reynolds in his notes. Their vital energy is so committed to correcting internal defects that they are left with little to combat external threats. In addition to physical problems, psychologists involved in the case documented the emotional and behavioral effects on the children. Sarah, the oldest and most verbally capable, demonstrated highly abnormal behavioral patterns, alternating between periods of deep apathy and explosions of self-directed aggressiveness. Joseph showed stereotyped, repetitive movements and seemed unable to form emotional connections with his caregivers. Rebecca, still very young, showed a significant delay in normal social development milestones, such as eye contact and response to her name. Dr. Caroline Meyer, a child psychologist designated to work with the children, noted in her report, in addition to the cognitive deficits resulting from genetic anomalies, these children suffered severe sensory and social deprivation during their formative years. They were raised in an environment where normal development was impossible, without appropriate stimuli, without appropriate social interaction, without exposure to the world beyond the isolated Caldwell property. The Caldwell case quickly became a fundamental study on the effects of prolonged consanguinity, quoted in medical textbooks and used in training programs for social workers, doctors, and psychologists for decades after its discovery. Harold Caldwell's trial took place in September 1958, away from the eyes of the public and the press. Missouri authorities, aware of the extraordinarily disturbing nature of the case, maintained the procedures in confidentiality to protect the victim's privacy and avoid turning the situation into a sensational spectacle. Harold, then 61, was found guilty of multiple charges, including forbidden relationships, child neglect, and abuse. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, effectively a life sentence considering his age. He refused to demonstrate remorse throughout the process, maintaining his distorted belief in Caldwell blood purification. "I didn't expect people from the outside to understand," were his only words during sentencing. "What we did was for the good of the family." Harold passed away at the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1967 at age 70 without ever recognizing the evil he had caused. No family member claimed his body, which was buried in the prison cemetery under a simple tombstone marked only with his prisoner number. The fate of Martha and her children followed a more complex and nuanced path. Martha, evaluated as a victim and not a perpetrator, was sent to a specialized psychological and social rehabilitation program in Kansas City, away from the Ozark Mountains and the memories they carried. Martha's case represents a unique challenge of rehabilitation, wrote Dr. Elizabeth Parker, responsible for her treatment. She needs not only to process the trauma of what she has lived but to essentially relearn what family, relationship, and identity mean. The process was slow and painful. Martha, initially confused and resistant, gradually began to understand the abnormality of her previous situation through exposure to healthy social environments and basic education. The first breakthroughs were particularly difficult. The moment she realized that what her grandfather had done was universally considered wrong and harmful caused a deep emotional crisis that demanded temporary hospitalization, Dr. Parker reported. She described feeling as if the floor under her feet had disappeared. All her understanding of the world and her identity had been fundamentally shaken. Martha's children were initially placed in specialized adoptive homes capable of dealing with their complex medical and developmental needs. Sarah and Joseph, with the most severe problems, were eventually transferred to long-term care institutions where they could receive the constant medical attention their conditions demanded. Rebecca, the youngest and least affected, was adopted by a family of doctors in St. Louis who had experience with children with special needs. Although her cardiac condition required multiple surgeries during her childhood, she was able to develop a level of functionality that surprised many of the experts involved in her initial case. In 1962, after 4 years of intensive treatment, Martha had progressed enough to be considered able to live semi-independently under a new identity to protect her from stigma. She was helped to settle in a small town in northern Missouri, where she worked as an assistant in a local library. She completed her basic education and eventually obtained a high school equivalency diploma. Authorities allowed supervised visits with Rebecca, the only one of her children capable of understanding the concept of a mother. These meetings, initially tense and emotionally charged, gradually evolved into a cautious but genuine relationship. Martha never returned to the Ozark Mountains. The Caldwell property was confiscated by the state and later sold. The main house was demolished, and new owners, unknown to the history of the site, established a cattle breeding farm in the area. The other extended family members, Caldwell cousins and half-siblings of Martha, were located by the authorities and received varying degrees of intervention depending on their involvement and condition. Daniel Caldwell, son of Harold and father of 2 children with his own daughter, received a sentence similar to his father's. His daughter Mary and her children received similar treatment to Martha's. The Caldwell case, although kept out of the media spotlight at the time, had a profound impact on Missouri's social work and child protection policies and eventually across the country. It led to the creation of specific protocols to identify and intervene in isolated communities where similar practices could occur. William Reynolds, the rural doctor who first documented the case, dedicated the rest of his career to educating medical professionals about the signs of consanguinity and family abuse. His pioneering work resulted in the 1965 publication of the Manual for Identification and Intervention in Isolated Communities, which became a key resource for social workers in rural regions. In 1970, Martha, then 32 and using her new name, Mary Wilson, had built a modest but stable life. She was still in therapy and had developed some significant social relationships. Although she never married or had more children, according to the monitoring reports of her designated social worker, she had found a delicate balance between recognizing her past and building a future. Rebecca, her youngest daughter with whom she kept in contact, graduated from high school in 1975, an extraordinary achievement considering her physical limitations and the initial prognosis of doctors. Although she was never able to live completely independently due to ongoing heart complications, she worked as a volunteer in a children's hospital, using her own experience to comfort children with complex medical conditions. If you have watched this far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to leave your like on this video and share it with someone you believe would also be interested in these historical revelations. If you are not yet subscribed, this is the perfect time to be part of this community that seeks to unravel the darkest secrets in American history. Sarah and Joseph, the most severely affected children, remained institutionalized for the rest of their lives. Sarah passed away in 1978 at the age of 24 from respiratory complications. Joseph lived until 1985, dying at 30, a surprising longevity considering the severity of his condition. The last official record related to the Caldwell case was a letter written by Rebecca to the Missouri Department of Social Services in 1982, requesting access to the original records to better understand her family history. "I don't look for these records out of resentment or anger," she wrote. "I look for them to understand who I am and where I came from. I believe that knowing our story, however painful, is the only way to really overcome it." The history of the Caldwells remains a dark reminder of the consequences of prolonged consanguinity, not only the genetic and physical consequences but also the human cost in terms of suffering, lost identity, and lives that never had a chance to achieve their full potential. In a final note of her follow-up assessment in 1980, Dr. Parker wrote about Martha, "The real miracle in Martha's case is not that she survived the horror of her initial situation, but that she found, despite everything, the ability to build something like a normal life. There is a resilience in the human spirit that even transcends the most fundamental violations of our nature." The Caldwell property in the Ozark Mountains is now unrecognizable, covered by new forests and without visible traces of what happened there. However, the genetic and psychological legacy of what happened in that isolated valley continues to reverberate through generations, a silent reminder that some secrets, once discovered, can never be truly buried.